Today we're going to show you how to grow one of these here in the desert. That's up next. Hello everyone, this is Dwayne with Edge of Nowhere Farm, and we're coming to you here in November. Now you can see this is actually one of our broiler chickens. This is one of the broilers that we raised in the spring of this year. And here we are in the fall, and you can probably hear it behind me. We've got another batch. It's about to wrap up here. So what we wanted to do is walk you through the steps and give you an idea of kind of best practices for us here in the desert of Arizona. For most of the country, you're raising broilers from spring through fall. Well, our season is actually two separate seasons. We have one in the fall and one in the spring. The challenge we have here in Arizona, we already know it's very, very hot in the summer, which is just way too much for these birds, and very cold in the winter. So we're down to freezing like everybody else in the winter time. The first one we start in the beginning of September, and that's what you're seeing here is our batch that's wrapping up here in November. The second one is the end of February, beginning of March. We found that these two time frames are perfect and ideal for these birds. They arrive when it's hot in the fall, and that's always our best batch. And then they finish when it's still nice and warm in May in that second batch. The reason we do the two separate batches is we found that the birds are comfortable pretty much the entire time. So the breed we're using here is the Cornish Cross. Now that's a standard breed. It's the one that you find in the grocery stores. If you're buying birds, it's typically what they're using. And for most of us that are raising them on pasture, we usually use those as well. The main reason is fantastic feed conversion, and you get go from a very small chick to a very large bird in 8 weeks. So the feed we use is very consistent. We use one feed the entire time. It's basically a 20% chick starter that we get from Tractor Supply. And again, that's used the entire time for the whole process. So let's take a look at how these birds arrive here on the farm. Biggest thing with the brooder is that we found is having it inside some type of structure is really ideal. If not, you're going to do a lot to try to keep them warm, especially in the spring season when you're coming into February, beginning of March. Definitely way too cold for them. Now, the advantage to the fall batch is getting here in September. You know, we're 105 plus degrees. Honestly, that is ideal for these birds. The challenge would be above, 105. So again, outside a little too hot, but you put them inside the garage. We put them in our outbuilding, and the temperature's just fine, especially in the fall. We don't even use a heat lamp. So you can see we're out here on our pasture. We take the birds once they're 3 weeks old, and we move them into the John Suscovich tractors that we use. Now, when we first put them on the pasture, we do use a pretty heavy stocking density. The main reason is we want to make sure that they remain warm. For that spring batch, when you're starting in February or March, you'll definitely need to add some supplemental heat, at least for the first week or two. In the fall, you won't need the heat, but in the evenings, it's still a bit too cold for them. So a little higher stocking density, they'll be able to bunch a little bit and keep themselves warm without a heat lamp. So now, as far as pasture movement, we move these birds at least once a day. In fact, for the first few weeks, it's once a day. Once you get into week 6 and beyond, you're probably going to need to move them at least twice a day. And so that just makes sure they're on new pasture, they're on greens, and you're not getting too much manure down on your pasture that might give you too much nitrogen. Once we get past week 3, we start restricting the feed on these birds, especially the Cornish Cross. If you don't do it, number one, you'll start getting leg problems fairly quickly, usually in week 3 or 4. Also, as they get older, we're about 7 weeks now, you'll start losing birds to things like ascites, which is basically congestive heart failure, and other conditions that elderly chickens would have. And so you'll want to restrict the feed. What we do is we feed them in the morning when we first move them, especially on the twice a day, and then we'll pull the feed after an hour or two. Then we won't feed them through the middle of the day, come back in the afternoon, we'll feed them again, and then pull that feed before we shut everything down for the night. So now what I want to do, I want to give you guys an idea of the progression of these birds from arrival through processing date at about 8.5 weeks. Cornish cross broilers typically go about 8 to 9 weeks. We like to raise them to about 8.5 weeks. Seems to be about right for us. With that, you get somewhere between a 4 and 6 pound bird, depending on circumstances, but that's ideal for us, and that's when we process. Now, before processing day, we take the broilers off of feed, so they get the last round of feed the morning before. And then what we like to do is actually pull them from the pasture. We put them in our livestock trailer to get them up off the ground. This just makes sure that there's nothing in the crop, and they get a chance to pretty much clean out for the most part before you go to process. Now, our steps for processing are pretty much what you see everybody else do. We're gonna go ahead and walk you through them. First thing you'll do is you're gonna make the kill cut. Typically what we'll do is we'll go on both sides, hit both jugular veins, and that will allow them to bleed out. It takes a couple of minutes and they're dispatched. Then we'll take them and put them in a scalder with 145-degree temp. The scalder that we have is actually from Stromberg's. It's one of our great resources for equipment like this. We've had it for years and it works fantastic for keeping that perfect temperature. Typically you're gonna dunk those for a couple of minutes. You're really just looking for the feathers to pull out easily, predominantly the wing feathers and the tail feathers. Once those feathers are coming out easy, you're ready for the plucker. Now, the Yardbird plucker is a fantastic option if you're only doing chickens. You can put a couple in it at a time. We have a larger one because we do Thanksgiving turkeys as well. Only takes about 15 seconds or so, and you don't want to run them in there too long. You'll start breaking wings and legs if it's too long. But once they're defeathered, you go to the evisceration stage. So once the details are done, all the pin feathers are out, we do go ahead and bag these. We prefer to put them in shrink bags. They last a good year or so in the freezer. All you need is 180, 185-degree water. With these shrink bags, you'll put a little hole in the towards the top of the bag to allow the air to escape. They shrink nicely around the bird. Put a sticker or a piece of tape across the hole, and then if you're gonna label them for sale, you put a label on there, and then they're ready to go. So now what we'll do is put those in the freezer and again, store those for up to a year, and they're just fine. Typically no freezer burn, at least in our experience. And so you got a year's worth of meat if you're not selling them like we do. One of the things that we do for folks here in Arizona is we do a workshop in the fall. Typically we've got about 30 or so people that'll come here, learn how to do the actual processing. YouTube doesn't like us to show some of those details, so we're not showing you here today. But if you get a chance, come on out this way or find a local farmer that does this if you want some hands-on experience when it comes to processing. It is a little daunting if you haven't done it before, but it's part of the process, quite literally. So a little bit different for us here in the desert when it comes to how and when we raise our chickens. Just remember, 2 batches if you're gonna be using the Cornish cross broiler. We like to do one in the fall. They come in September. Don't even need a heat lamp for that brooder. We finish them in November. And then we like to bring them in at the end of February, beginning of March. They definitely will need some heat when they get there, but once you finish them on pasture, perfect temperatures. We've just found that avoiding the middle of winter when it's way too cold, and obviously the middle of summer when it's just way too hot for broilers here in the desert. The last thing that we have here to do is to reseed our pasture. We use a perennial rye for our winter grass, which is the greens that our spring chickens are feeding on. And then we overseed with alfalfa that grows all summer long, and alfalfa is what this fall batch was feeding on. We found for at least us, if we're not gonna be using Bermuda, which we don't wanna do here, those work just fine. Hopefully we've encouraged you to give this a shot if you've been thinking about it. Even here in the Arizona desert, with a couple of tweaks, you definitely can have pasture-raised chicken all for yourself. So just wanted to thank you for joining us today. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel. We cover a lot of things here on this Sonoran desert farm and would love to see you on a regular basis. If you have any questions or comments, those go in the comments section down below. And our Amazon shop, I'll leave a link down in the description. That's a free, painless way to help support the channel. If you start with the link down below, it doesn't matter what you buy, you help to support us here. So just want to thank you for joining us today and remind you, if we can farm on the edge of nowhere, so can you.